My name is Phil Boaz. I'm the Director of Design and Learning Methods at Mount Eliza Executive Education. This morning we're going to I'm going to talk to you about emotional intelligence. Now, this is a buzzword that people just love. You might ask yourself, what's the biggest article response that Harvard Business Review has ever had? And you probably wouldn't choose emotional intelligence. But in 2004, in the January edition, an article on emotional intelligence turns out to have been the most read article in the history of the journal. Now, when we looked at this, given that we know how totally minimalist the workforce engagement with emotions is supposed to be, we were curious as to know why on earth does an article on emotional intelligence turn out to be the most significant article that's been written in the Harvard Business Review. How on earth does this happen? How do you account for it? What we found was that the more we thought about why it had got to be so popular, the more clear it was that this is a topic that has been front of mind for people for years, but not acceptable as a topic to talk about. We like to pretend that what goes on up here is actually what matters. So thinking, being rational, being intelligent, that's okay. But being emotional, being feeling, being concerned about the emotional transactions or how they actually mess with your head, none of that is actually the main stuff of business or of organisations. So we started to look at whether this was a topic that we could meaningfully put into the workplace, and what we found, of course, was that already the workplace was accepting the words. They weren't accepting that it was a great thing to do, but they loved the words. And the thing about emotional intelligence is you can write books about it. People can listen to stories about it. You can have research that proves conclusively that emotionally intelligent people do better. They sell better, they're better managers, they're better leaders, they're better at goddamn everything if you believe the research, and that is our new religion. So science has demonstrated that emotions are meaningful. What that has not translated into is people actually demonstrating emotional competence in the workplace. And there are lots of programs that people go to where they learn about emotional intelligence. That's not the same as being emotionally intelligent. So, what's the history of this thing? Intelligence has been an issue in the psychological community for over a century. Back in the early 1900s, two people, one of whom was David Wechsler, produced an intelligence test for adults where he described intelligence as the ability to think rationally, act purposefully, and deal effectively with your environment. And he developed a test which you could take, and it told you how intelligent you were, and if you got a score of 100, you were sort of average. You expected to be 110, 120, 140 if you were really outstanding, and if you're really totally stupid, 90, 80, or if you were retarded or had serious problems, 50, 60, intellectually disabled. So in that world of psychometrics, even David Wechsler said, well, intelligence is not just about what goes on in your head and your ability to think rationally. It is also driven by your emotional state. We should have and be talking about more than just what goes on in my head. It was actually several decades before anyone seriously took up that offer. It wasn't until someone like Howard Gardner in about 1982 wrote a book on multiple intelligences, and suddenly we weren't talking about just what went on in our heads. We were talking about feelings, we were talking about interpersonal skills, we were talking about musical skills, spatial skills, arithmetic skills. A whole lot of new intelligences had just been dumped on the table. Now, up until about that time, people firmly believed that intelligence was something you were born with, it was in your genes, and basically you weren't going to be able to crank it up. However, this is the 21st century, and neuroscience is now demonstrating to all of us that you can change your intelligence, you can rewrite a lot of your own brain mechanisms. When emotional intelligence came on the scene, they had to be saying that you can improve this, otherwise if you got a bad score, you were just going to be seriously depressed for the rest of your life. So if you were going to put something like emotional intelligence into a business context, you had to be able to say to people, hey, you may look like you're an emotional disabled person, but you can actually learn to be better, and we can run the workshop for you that will show you how to do that. There was clearly money to be made in emotional intelligence, and selling it to all those deprived executives who did not have a lot of emotional intelligence became a big business. Now, the question that sits in the midst of this is probably best exemplified by a model we built 15 or 20 years ago called the Green Line. The Green Line was a kind of accident of one of us working on the whiteboard with a green texter, and above the Green Line we were using a model that had the rational world, and below the Green Line we had a model which was the non-rational world. And above the Green Line you could think, and below the Green Line you could feel, and a whole lot of other variables, so that you've got rational systems. Above the Green Line you've got organisational systems and legal systems. Below the Green Line you've got social systems, cultural systems, and all the relational systems. So essentially what you've got is this map that splits between the rational and the non-rational world in your organisation. Now, big thing is this. We were working with executive and management teams developing leadership capabilities, and what we found was that when we explored with people what they were good at and how their organisations worked and what they paid attention to, the thing that showed up sharpest was intellectual, rational, cognitive. About 80% of all the things they thought of in their organisation as being important were rational, and about 20% non-rational. There was a recognition that you needed some of that stuff, but it was pretty minimal. So we figured when we were running these workshops, we should turn this over. Make our workshops about 80% non-rational and 20% rational, and try to get a balance between the rational and non-rational into living organisational systems. So a lot of the work that became possible with the advent of emotional intelligence was to open a door to a whole different part of the life of an organisation and the relationships of the people in it that had not been opened before. Now, you might think that this is a fairly recent notion in business and organisations, and you'd be right. It wasn't until 1990 that the words were actually used for the first time in the literature. And Solovey and Myers used the words in an article in about 1990, and it wasn't until 1995 when Goldman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence that became a business bestseller. From that time on, business has been curious about what is this thing. The important thing about it is that it opened a door to have discussions people wouldn't let you have before. Suddenly you could talk about emotional intelligence. Now, if you're going to talk about emotional intelligence, you've got to be talking at least in part about feelings, because emotions are your feeling states. And the reality is, if you think about the meetings you've sat in, you'll know that it's not just your ability to be intellectually clear that makes it possible to solve problems and make decisions. It's about how you feel about the people sitting around you. And in another place at another time we'll talk a little bit about what happens in meetings and groups and teams. But emotional intelligence is a very powerful platform that needs to be put inside these entities called organisations for humans to exist in there and function. Most people don't argue that you need an accounting degree or an engineering degree or a legal degree, that you need qualifications in the technical, professional expertise of your business. But most people would not accept that you need a similar amount of training and development for the emotional reality that you bring in and everyone else brings in to every transaction that is involved in you making your business work. But if you don't bring in ways to deal with people who are in fact the vehicle for getting all your work done, then what you've got is a gap. And you can go on doing all the intellectual stuff and all the professional stuff and all the technical stuff, but you'll be missing out on the driving force that controls most of that process. So we figured that the non-rational domain was a domain of significant learning that needs to exist in business and in organisations. And so we began to look at what it was that people were doing when they went to these emotional intelligence workshops, getting more emotional intelligence, we thought. What we found was that most people were learning a lot about emotional intelligence, but they weren't doing a lot about becoming more emotionally intelligent, which was, we figured, what actually needed to happen. And it's still our feeling that this is a very heavy bias in most of the work that's done in emotional intelligence is to tell people about it but not engage. So why don't people engage? Well, in order to engage in emotionally intelligent behaviour and learning, you need to be emotionally intelligent. Because this isn't saying you don't get some quantum of this and you stuff it into people's heads. You actually have to experience someone behaving in an emotionally intelligent way. So the people running the workshops couldn't just pick up the book or pick up a folder and learn anything except to tell you about emotional intelligence. They can quote you the research. There are hundreds of studies, mostly supported by people who wanted to demonstrate that there was some point in learning about emotional intelligence. So they demonstrate that there is a point, that people do better when they have it. What would you expect, really? I mean, there was some wonderful research financed at the cost of $100,000 or more that demonstrated that babies being fed mother's milk did better than babies on bottles. Now, that piece of intelligence probably has been around the human species for thousands of years, even millions. We didn't really need a huge research study to tell us what was obvious. It should not take a great deal of research to tell us what most people know. That if you can't deal with your emotions, if you can't engage with other people's emotions, if you don't know what's going on out there with someone you're talking to, if you cannot engage with what's going on out there, if you can't identify what's going on in here and engage with what's going on in here and then make the interface work, you're probably going to be less effective than if you could. So essentially, emotional intelligence is about learning to do a number of things which are part of everyday, ordinary life. There is nothing extraordinary about emotional intelligence at all. In spite of all the books that have been written and all the articles that have been written, it's a very simple map. And I'll lay that map out for you in a minute and show you how the pieces fit together. Essentially, these days when people are going to do a workshop, they first look at, can I measure this thing? So guess what? Once the label had become available, every psychometrician worth their salt set about trying to figure out how to write a test which would measure this thing and make them money. So we scanned the Mental Measurement Yearbook for 2008 and found when you plugged in emotional intelligence, you got 66 hits. 66 instruments in that yearbook measure some aspect of emotional intelligence. So we thought, wow, we knew about 4 of these instruments we'd ever heard of. What was more interesting was when we culled out all the little bits that were in other personality inventories and type inventories, we ended up with approximately 34 that looked like they were measuring something either called emotional intelligence or some kind of checklist or some kind of psychometric instrument. That was pretty impressive. Then we looked around at our school to find we were using 2. And we'd only been using the second one recently because someone had heard about it. So we did a search of the literature on all 34 instruments. What we found, looking at things like validity and reliability and other esoteric psychometrics, was that there's not a lot of connection between what one person's measuring for emotional intelligence and another person. And one organisation got really smart, took the top 4 or 5 of these instruments, culled out the common themes and built a new test around that one. This was like the common measurement for emotional intelligence. So there's things like Genos and Mesquite and Schutz and OCI and Baron. There's a whole range of these labels you can find in the literature, which basically are the labels for a small but successful business in the measurement of this thing called emotional intelligence. When you've finished measuring yourself and found what you are on a normal distribution, you are probably not a lot better off than you were before. So the very smart test manufacturers then went about putting together little works for you, exercises you could do to increase your emotional intelligence. And some of these are elegant little exercises and do a nice job in doing some of that work. So it is possible to do this thing called test-retest, where you find out how emotionally intelligent you are or aren't, and then you do all these activities that are supposed to increase your score on that instrument. Now, what I'd like to say to you is that we decided we had to find some way of teaching this thing. So we created a model out of the work that had been done by other people. And we created 4 quadrants, which you'll see on the little diagram that we've built for this. But it's very simple. The first part of emotional intelligence, we figured, was self-awareness. You have to have some ability to recognise your own emotions, your own feeling states. You have to know something about where these come from. How did you get them? Did they arrive in your genes, or did you acquire them from your family of origin or the people around you? You had to get them from somewhere. And as people from the same family don't have the same amount of this, it probably didn't come in the genes. It actually is learnt, we believe. So, okay, you learn to pay attention to yourself. You learn that some things are good to pay attention to and some things are not good to pay attention to. So everybody acquires a slightly different mindset about how much should I pay attention to me? How much should I notice who I am, what I do, how I do it, what emotions I'm afraid of, what emotions I like? And what relationship do I have with my emotions? Do I deny them? Do I accept them? Do I explore them? Do I understand them? So there's a whole domain which is about helping people understand how to pay attention to themselves. Then there's a whole domain that says, okay, how do you pay attention to other people? You're doing this thing with yourself, now how do you do something with them? So another part of the model came to be other awareness. How do I arrange myself to notice somebody else, to recognise their emotional states, to be able to test that my perceptions of their emotional states are accurate? How do I get to understand what's going inside somebody else? And I can do that in some way that allows their self-awareness to develop if my capacity to observe them accurately and be aware of them can be developed. Okay, so that's awareness. Now what can I do? Now I'm sort of learned to observe better and I learned to pay attention better. Now, before I can build a relationship, I've still got one more step to go. How do I manage my emotions? Because I prepare myself when I go to a meeting or any kind of event by thinking about and reading up on the topic and getting all the bits of information. But do I prepare my emotional states? Do I even think that I can determine what emotional state I'll turn up in? Do I enter a relationship with my partner with my brain in gear and my heart in gear? Mostly probably not, unless you're a bit lucky. So there's a whole domain that says, how do I learn to be in charge of my emotional states, and particularly be in charge of the ones I want to be in charge of, and pull the ones I want into life when I need them. If I can do that, and that is not hard to do, there's a whole domain of personal development that's available for learning to do that, in a whole lot of fields that come out of psychotherapy, Gestalt, psychodrama, neuro-linguistic programming, and a whole lot of other frames of reference that are available for learning to change your own reality. Then finally I'm ready for the last step in the box, which is managing others, which is how people engage with all their relationships. I like to call it simple manipulative skills. You might think of it as influencing with integrity. You might just think of it as getting what you want, because that's what relationships are about. If I can get what I want from you, the chances are in order to do that, I'm going to have to give you what you want from me. So we begin a relational process. And so in essence, emotional intelligence is about being able to be aware of others, be able to manage yourself, be able to manage others, and essentially that's what a relationship is. And there really is nothing new about emotional intelligence. It's been around since there have been Homo sapiens sapiens. That's you. And that's basically what emotional intelligence has been all about. Thank you.